Good evening, everyone. I'm Vince Stango, Chief Operating Officer at the National Constitution Center, and I'm so pleased that you could all join us tonight for our program, Is the World Rejecting American Constitutionalism? We are pleased to partner with the University of Pennsylvania on this compelling conversation, which marks the opening event of this year's Penn's program on democracy, citizenship, and constitutionalism, supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Mary and David Boys Family Fund. Here at the National Constitution Center, we've spent the better part of this past week and really the past year celebrating the 225th anniversary of the Constitution, which was signed just across the street at Independence Hall on September 17th, 1787. As the Museum of We the People, the Center is proud to serve as the national headquarters of this historic milestone year. And while we have done plenty of celebrating in honor of our Constitution's 225th anniversary, tonight we will turn to some serious questions. What do other nations think of America's Constitution? And is the world rejecting our founding principles? These were timely questions when this program was planned months ago, but they have been even more so in light of the recent anti-American protests and violence that have spread across the Middle East, including the tragic death of America's ambassador to Libya and other officials. Today, we are fortunate to be joined by an outstanding panel of experts who will guide our conversation about the global influence, relevance, and challenges facing American constitutionalism. Our panel includes Professor Akhil Amar, Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale University and the author of the recently published book, America's Unwritten Constitution, and on a personal note, a great friend of the Constitution Center. Professor David Law, Professor of Law and Political Science at Washington University in St. Louis, who has done extensive fieldwork on constitutional adjudication and judicial politics across Asia. Professor David Armitage, the Lloyd C. Blankfein Professor of History and Chair of the Department of History at Harvard University, who has lectured, taught, and held research fellowships around the globe. I'm also delighted that our moderator for today's discussion is Professor Rick Beeman. Rick is the John Welsh Centennial Professor of History Emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania, where he has been a member of the faculty for over 40 years. He has written 7 books and several dozen articles on America's political and constitutional history, and we're grateful to have his expertise today. I'm also grateful to call him a trustee and a friend. After the program, I invite you to join us for a reception upstairs in our John C. Bogle Chairman's Room. Volunteers will be on hand to point out where to go after this evening's program. And after you get home, I encourage you to check our website for the recently announced fall program schedule. In fact, Professor Amar will be back tomorrow at 1 p.m. to speak about his new book, America's Unwritten Constitution. And please feel free to check out our blog, Constitution Daily, to join in conversation about the Constitution with distinguished scholars, journalists, and politicians. And now just a few final details before we welcome tonight's guests. We will have time for a few audience questions after the conversation, and our staff will be roving the auditorium with microphones to do so. If you do have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the mic before asking your question. And as a courtesy to the other people in the audience, please limit yourself to a single brief question. And finally, I have to ask you all to silence your cell phones and anything that blinks or beeps in consideration of your fellow guests tonight. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professors Akhil Amar, David Armitage, David Law, and Rick Beeman.
Thank you, Vince. Hi, I'm Rick Beeman. I suspect many of you have been in this space before, and if you have, then you can realize my temptation to step out from behind the podium. We the people, who are we the people. But that's not what we're here to do tonight. As Vince said, our topic tonight is the impact of the American Constitution and American constitutionalism globally. In discussing those questions, we may get into a somewhat larger but I think related question, namely the extent that the United States Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are still reflections of American values, and indeed the extent to which American values are embraced or not embraced around the world. Our format tonight is as follows. Each of our three panelists will speak for about 10 minutes on these questions. My very limited role, which I will exercise now, is to ask, actually to beg, our three panelists to stay within their time limit, because we really do want, at the end of their presentations, to have the three of them engage in a conversation, and then also to leave plenty of time for those of you in the audience who might wish to ask a question to join the discussion as well. With that, I did leave something out. I really do want to acknowledge the leadership of Roger Smith. Where is Rogers? Okay, come on, Roger, stand up. He is the director of Penn's program in democracy, citizenship, and constitutionalism, not only the organizer of a whole year's worth of events and symposia relating to constitution making. This is our theme for this year, and this is the kickoff event, and we're terrifically grateful to him. So without further ado, I'd like to ask David Law to begin our conversation, and we'll take it from there. David.
Well, I too want to thank the Penn Program on Democracy, Citizenship, and Constitutionalism, and Roger Smith. It's an honor to be here to discuss the question, is the world rejecting American constitutionalism? And I'm going to take this question somewhat literally, which means I'm not going to talk about whether American constitutionalism is a good thing, and I'm not going to talk about whether the embrace or rejection of American constitutionalism by other countries is good or bad. Those are all interesting questions, but before we can engage in normative critique, we have to know whether we're talking about something real, right? You don't want to debate how many angels dance on the head of a pin or whether angels are good or bad if you don't know if angels exist. So, is the world rejecting American constitutionalism? So the answer depends to some extent on, I'm going to be annoying and professorial about this. What do you mean by American constitutionalism? What do you mean by the world? And what level of generality or specificity are you interested in? Why? So what do we mean by American constitutionalism? So there's this document called the Constitution. I'm going to call that the Large C Constitution. And if you're talking about the Large C Constitution, the one that's kept behind plexiglass to which we pledge allegiance, then logic and anecdotal experience and quantitative data all suggest that quite clearly American constitutionalism in this sense is being rejected. Okay, so, and mainly I'll be talking about whether constitution makers in other countries are emulating this large C constitution or instead rejecting it as a model. And if that's the question, the answer is yes, we're seeing rejection. If you're talking about the small C constitution, which would include norms and practices and unwritten conventions, judicial interpretations, fundamental statutes like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Social Security Act, then the question is harder to answer because it's much harder to define the contours of the thing you're trying to study. It's like trying to figure out the movement of something that's very blurry, right? But I think even if you focus on that blurrier small C constitution, there is still some evidence that the world is increasingly turning away from the US, even as a small C constitutional model. Okay, so we also have to figure out what lens we want to look at the world through, right? You want to use a macro lens or a zoom lens? How closely are you looking for signs of American influence in different constitutional systems? Are you looking for just vague resemblance, adoption of overarching ideas, or do you care about how broad ideas are put into practice? So, for example, if you look at Seurat's painting of a Sunday afternoon at La Granchette, right, and if you look at Monet's Water Lilies painting, from a sufficient distance, what you see are colorful blobs of oil on canvas, right, and from that distance they look similar. But if you get close enough, right, those resemblances begin to disappear. Similarities at that incredibly large distance, they don't tell you very much about the defining critical choices that the artists are making that really define the artist. Likewise, if you view constitutionalism from this really, really macro perspective, you might see some very big similarities, right? But how important are those similarities really? Okay, now, so if you really zoom out, here are some of the ways in which American constitutionalism continues to be influential. the very idea of having a written constitution. So the United States, along with France and Poland, can lay claim legitimately to having basically pioneered the idea of constitution writing. Getting together, deliberating over how government should be set up would be a good way to do things, and come up with something that is not only more legitimate, but better than what came before, right? So to engage in the writing of a constitution is both an expression of popular sovereignty and a vehicle for self-improvement. Okay, so maybe the US pioneered that. The idea of entrenchment of the Constitution against change by an ordinary majority, that's wildly popular. So about 90% of the world's constitutions make the Constitution harder to amend than ordinary legislation. That's popular. The idea of a Bill of Rights, right? Australia is now the only quote-unquote Western nation that doesn't have a Bill of Rights at any level, national or local. Also very popular. Judicial review. This is something that 82% of the world's countries currently do. The US pioneered the idea of binding judicial enforcement of formal constitutional rights, right? 80+%. Popular ratification of the Constitution, not as popular as entrenchment or the Bill of Rights or judicial review. And actually, the percentage of constitutions requiring ratification peaked at around 1920 or so at about 70%. It's now declined to about 60%. But still, the idea of ratification is something that has clearly caught on in a lot of places. Now, having said that, even at this really general level, there are a lot of things that the US Constitution does that have not caught on, right? The idea of a separation of powers, presidentialism, where you have this separation between the legislative and the executive functions, is something that has actually declined in popularity. It peaked at around 45%. Now it's around 35%. Federalism is less popular now than it was in 1800. 22% of the world's constitutions, or world's countries provided for it then, 12% do now. So once you start to zoom in, then other countries start to look even less like the US. So my co-author and I, Mila Versteeg, we end up showing on the basis of statistical analysis that other countries are not copying the US Constitution, right? So it's one thing to say that other countries have judicial review. It's another thing to say, well, what kind of judicial review do they have? Other countries have bills of rights. That's one thing. But it's another thing to say, well, what kinds of rights are they putting in their Bill of Rights, right? And you don't need to crunch, 700 plus constitutions of data over 60 years to know that the US Constitution at that level of detail, at that level of generality, is not being copied. Now, Justice Ginsburg has gotten flack for suggesting, heaven forfend, that something other than the US Constitution might be the better model for Egypt. But this recognition that the 225-year-old document isn't the greatest template is nothing new. Even Justice Frankfurter in the 1950s beseeched the drafters of the Indian Constitution not to copy the Due Process Clause, right? Here's a clear example. US occupation authorities wrote Japan's constitution. And if you were even vaguely progressive, the US-written Japanese constitution is so much better than the US Constitution itself, right? The Japanese constitution does not read like the US Constitution. It gives workers the right to organize, to bargain, to act collectively. It guarantees academic freedom. It guarantees minimum standards of wholesome and cultured living, mandatory free public education, the right and obligation to work. Property rights have to conform to public welfare, explicit prohibition of torture, the right to compensation from the government if you are acquitted after arrest or detention, right? So if you're an American liberal or progressive, it would be a pipe dream to have these sorts of things in the US Constitution. And the United States wrote those into the Japanese Constitution. We don't have them ourselves. So even given the opportunity, we don't copy the US Constitution. So, and it's not surprising that other countries don't copy it, right? It is 225 years old. The average constitution lasts 19 years. Ours is 225 years old. We rarely amend it, right? So we've got this patched up Rube Goldberg contraption. The average constitution is 14,000 words. Ours is less than half that length. It started at less than a third. So other countries have newer, more detailed constitutions. We have an old, vague, fuzzy framework that we have to fill in. So even if you wanted to copy American constitutionalism, you wouldn't copy the large C document. You would instead copy the small c constitution. You'd copy the way things actually work, not the way they're described in this document, right? But again, this patched up, this is sort of like you have a choice between choosing a patched up version of Windows 0.3 alpha, right, so that it still works, or you can copy the brand new operating system that's written to scratch with modern needs and circumstances in mind, right? It would be strange to choose to copy directly the old patched up version. You have to pretend that the current Constitution addresses questions like Is it a search within the meaning of the Fourth Amendment to put a GPS device on a car, right? The framers didn't know what a car was. They probably would have been terrified by the idea of global positioning satellites, right? So you have to pretend that the document addresses these sorts of things. Other countries, given a clean slate to work with, it's not surprising they don't pretend. They simply write a document that's more thorough and addresses these questions. So the irony, I think, though, the ultimate irony about claims that the American Constitution is influential is that in so many ways we ourselves are the ones who have turned our back on what is best and most worthy about American constitutionalism. By that I mean, so we put the paper behind plexiglass, this piece of paper. We speak reverently of the framers and of the framing, but first we don't copy our own constitution, even when we're writing constitutions for other countries. And the worst irony of all is we pioneered the practice of deliberating over the design of government, bringing to bear reason and the lessons of experience. We pioneered the act of constitution making, and yet now, in a world where the average constitution lasts 19 years, American constitutional law scholars have practically forgotten about the entire enterprise of constitutional drafting and focused all of their attention, practically, on judicial interpretation. And we've become attached to the Constitution as if it were a museum piece. We invent constitutional drafting as an exercise in rational self-government, and we're keen to take credit for it, but we don't practice it ourselves. We've largely given up on the exercise of forming a, quote, more perfect union as if we got it right and we can't do better than what we've got. That is arguably the ultimate repudiation of American constitutionalism. Thank you.
David has given us a long list of the reasons why the American Constitution is moving toward obsolescence. And now we'll hear from Akhil Amar.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be back here in Philadelphia, where it all began. And thank you, Rogers, in particular, and to the National Constitution Center. So, boy, it looks pretty bad for the good old US of A. Unless you actually think about the big picture. And this maybe is zooming out. But sometimes it's the big picture that counts. Apart from the shooting, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the play? So, big picture. Big picture is the following. The world is increasingly American because of what happened here in Philadelphia 225 years ago this week. Nothing less than the hinge of modern world history. For millennia before September 17th, 1787, very little democracy across the planet. Self-government had existed in a few tiny little city-states in ancient Greece, pre-imperial Rome, Florence, other places, and they hadn't been able to sustain themselves militarily against allies. They basically had largely blinked out. And even when they did exist, they existed in a city with people meeting face to face, people who worshipped the same gods, spoke the same language, had the same culture and climate, not warm weather and cold weather people getting together for a collective project. That's the previous 2 millennia. Very little democracy in the history of planet Earth, for all of recorded history before September 17th, 1787. Look at around the world on September 17th, 1787, or 16th, the day before. Who governs themselves, really, on the planet? Well, outside of America, to some extent, the Brits. They've got a House of Commons and a jury system, but they also have a hereditary monarch who has a lot of power and an aristocratic House of Lords that's quite powerful. Who else governs themselves? Maybe a few goat herders and sheep herders in Switzerland. There are no Swiss banks, so Mitt Romney is not interested in them at that point, so no real wealth there. A few folks in the Dutch Republic who are in the process of losing their self-governance. That's it. No real self-governance in the Russias or China or India, Africa, the continent of Europe. The world is governed by princes, kings, khans, sultans, Mughal lords, tribal chiefs, thugs. That's before September 17th, 1787. And now you look at the world, and half the world is democratic. half the world is democratic in population and landmass, and I like our chances for the next century, that our, meaning democracy's chances, meaning America's chances, because we show the world that democracy can exist and on a continental scale and bringing together warm and cold weather peoples and different religions and different cultures. So that is our world. It's a democratic world. It's a world that is far more democratic than in 1900, far more democratic than in 1940. India, where my parents came from, 1 billion people. It doesn't have self-governance when my parents are born, and it does now. And it's got a written constitution, and it's multicultural and multi-religious, and there's, epic free speech, actually, and free exercise of religion, and it is on the American model. That's 1 billion people. Okay? So, big picture, ladies and gentlemen. The world is far more democratic now than it was on September 16th, 1787. And who could doubt that it's because of the success, fundamentally, of the American constitutional project. It's military success, it's political success, it's ideological success, it's economic success. That is the hinge of human history. What happened here 225 years ago? Before, very little democracy. Now, much more. And it ain't because of the French. They are very proud of their revolution. I don't think it ends so well. It ends in a bloodbath. Ours doesn't. We have epic free speech. This year, 225 years ago, where we, the people, yes, we, the people, get together. Epic free speech across a continent. The thing is put to a vote up and down a continent, and you can be for it or against it, and the votes are pretty fair and free. Maybe better than Florida 2000, better than we might. So this is an embarrassment. I agree that we have to live up to this. We have a lot to live up to, and there is a question of whether we're living up to it, and we make promises, and we don't always redeem them in practice. But epic free speech 225 years ago, up and down the continent, you can be for the thing or against it, and no one's going to put you in prison, no one's going to vote you off the island. That didn't happen in 1776. 1776, if you're not put to a vote, and if you're opposed to the Declaration of Independence, here are your choices. 1, leave. 2, shut the hell up. That's it. Because this is war, and the King of England has sent over 30,000 troops, and they're here to, when they arrive, they'll slit our throats, and we must hang together, or we'll assuredly hang separately, says Ben Franklin, and he means hanged by the neck until we're all dead. So this is not a philosophy seminar in 1776. You're against us, then either leave or shut up. And no one who opposes the Declaration of Independence in 1776 goes on to any position of public authority in America. But people who oppose the Constitution, afterwards, in independent America, but the people who oppose the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists, they give us the Bill of Rights, in effect, and they become presidents of the United States, James Monroe, and vice presidents, Elbridge Gerry and George Clinton, and justices on the Supreme Court, Samuel Chase. It's pretty amazing. It's a vote, and people speak freely, and no one dies. For a whole year, you compare this to the French Revolution and others. And that is what is giving you the world today. So the world today is democratic. That's the first big thing. Big picture. Way more democratic than ever before. And what's the cause of it? I think it's the United States of America and its constitutional example. And we almost basically destroy ourselves because of slavery. And Mr. Lincoln is aware of that, and that's why he says we cannot allow people who lose election fair and square to overturn it by force of arms, because if we do, government of, by, and for the people will will vanish from the earth. This is the last best hope of earth, and all the democratic experiments, or most of them, in Europe have collapsed in 1848. We have to make it work here, and slavery was almost the death of us. So we mark this month, this week, not just the 225th anniversary of the Constitution, but the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, which issues right after the Battle of Antietam, which is fought on September 17th, 1862, 75 years to the day after the Constitution was signed here in Philadelphia. So that's going to be important too. But democracy around the world, written constitutions, that's the American project, judicial review, fundamental feature. You won't find it in the words of the Constitution. So I actually think basically it's a mistake to try to just fundamentally, just have a fundamental methodological disagreement with folks who look at and just try to compare word counts in this document versus that one, because, that's like, how did you enjoy the play rather than apart from the shooting? You're just not going to see the big picture, and it's the big picture that matters. So democracy, Written constitutions, judicial review, bills of rights, these are fundamentally, now, in the details, lots of variation, that's fine. Why do I not care about them, not obsess about them? Because democracies have certain defining features, and they generally, at least thus far, haven't gone to war against each other, and one hopes this is a Kantian idea of democratic peace, that democracies are fundamentally different in their essence than others, because populations don't want to actually kill other populations without, and suffer risks of being killed themselves without very, very good reasons. Dictators are more willing to attack other societies, so democracies are maybe, at least vis-a-vis other democracies, better. No famines in democracies. This is Amartya Sen's big insight. Democracies have self-correcting mechanisms that other societies don't, because you don't get information into the process. Since early versions of Microsoft 1.0, whatever were mentioned, the Constitution, because actually it's democratic, actually does permit revision. The first set of revisions is called the Bill of Rights, and they come from that year-long conversation that begins on September 17th, 1787, where a bunch of people say, you know, there are bugs in this first version. Where are the rights? And it's crowdsourced, in effect, the Constitution itself, and we call the result of that the Bill of Rights, and the people who lost in the constitutional vote, the anti-federalists, they win the next time around. Really impressive. And they put the words "the people" in a whole bunch of amendments. Amendments 1, 2, 4, 5, 4, 9, 10, 5 different amendments that say "the people," echoing the "we the people," because it's coming up, bubbling up for we the people. And if you ask me, is that experiment alive and well today? I would say yes, in the state constitutions. And the state constitutions actually look a lot like the federal constitution. They're written constitutions with separate bills of rights, 3 branches of government, bicameral legislatures, except in Nebraska, judicial review, 2 parties, single-member districts, the same 2 parties everywhere, executives who look a lot like presidents, we call them governors with veto pens and the like. So actually quite a lot of emulation of the American Constitution among 50 of the great republics in the world. They're called states. California as a state would rank ahead of France. Has a bigger GDP, and it looks like the American Constitution. It's different in the federal Constitution in some small respects, but I respectfully think that there actually is a pretty robust reaffirmation of the basic American model at the state level. Now, here's where I agree. I think there is one, and then I'll step down. I think one fundamental difference between many constitutions abroad and the American is there has been a fundamental rejection of American-style separation of powers. And this might be actually a good thing. I'm not sure separation of powers is actually the best way of organizing a democratic society. I think there are 2 great democratic traditions, the parliamentary and the separation of powers. Juan Linz, the great political scientist at Yale, actually says presidential systems are actually more prone to breakdown and war and gridlock and presidents vying against legislatures and nothing getting done, and presidents being tempted then to resort to unilateralism and sort of military, grab military power because the legislature is ineffective. That's possible. It is possible that parliamentary systems might be better than separation of power systems. I say that's within the democratic family. Let 1,000 flowers bloom, that's fine. But here's one other thing. Here's one reason why we might not want Japan to have like a presidential system. Because presidential systems are really good at waging wars. Maybe we don't want Japan to wage wars. Been there, done that. So yes, if I'm writing as an American a constitution for Japan, I'm not sure I want to encourage them to have a strong military figure a la George Washington. But that's not necessarily because this is the separation of powers is a presidentialist model is worse. It might be if Japan has it, it's worse for America. So there are alternative explanations for some of these things. But I do agree that one fundamental point is these other democracies around the world are not always separation of power systems. They're also not always 2-party systems. And those, I think, I'm not sure necessarily our system is the best, but it's ours, and it works probably well enough for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Akil. And now David Armitage has the enviable job of sliding himself between these 2 somewhat contrasting positions.
Akil said he was going to give you the big picture. Let me give you the really big picture here. 1776, look around the world. What do you have? You have a world almost entirely made up of empires rather than states. Look around the world here in 2012, 100% of the world's population either lives within a state or wishes it lived within a state. The only exceptions to that are places like Guantanamo Bay and Antarctica. If you're a penguin, you're outside the state system. If you're not a penguin, you're either inside it or you want to be inside it. How did that world of states, the world that we all inhabit, come to be? And indeed, what was the basis upon which an American Constitution was even imaginable in the first place? The basis on which the US Constitution became imaginable was on the basis of independence. Where did independence come from, or where did it originate, at least as a claim? It originated with the Declaration of Independence. This is my way of getting out of having to adjudicate between my distinguished colleagues by taking the story back and pulling out the focus a little bit more. No Declaration of Independence, no US Constitution, no Declaration of Independence, no world of states, no world of states, a world of empires. A world of empires is the undemocratic world, the very opposite of the world that Akil was telling us about, and which we would all hope that we will ultimately inhabit. So my basic claim is the really fundamentally important and revolutionary act of the American Revolution was the promulgation of the Declaration of Independence, and without that, as the basic feature, as it were, of the operating system of the United States, we would not have had the Constitution, and without the Constitution, we wouldn't even have the question of whether American constitutionalism would or would not have a larger impact around the world. So what was the impact of the Declaration of Independence? Let's look back to the early 19th century. Let's indeed take a great observer of the world in that period. In 1815, John Adams, looking around the world, in particular looking at the Western Hemisphere, said famously, the last 25 years of the last century, meaning the 18th century, and the first 15 of this may be called the age of revolutions and constitutions. We, that is the inhabitants of the United States, began the dance and have produced 18 or 20 models of constitutions. Many interesting things about that quotation. Just pick a couple of them. 18 or 20 models of constitutions. He means the federal constitution as well as, of course, the state constitutions. We're not talking here today about the influence of the state constitutions around the world. That's if we wanted to think about, as it were, a race between the basic documents of American constitutionalism, there are three runners in that race, or three groups of runners: the federal constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the state constitutions. The state constitutions drop out pretty quickly, having had a very good start, a really good sprint. We know, for instance, in the French Revolution, most of the attention by French revolutionary constitutionalists, at least in the early stages of the revolution, was on the state constitutions, not the federal constitution. But the state constitutions drop out pretty quickly, so it's as it were, a two-person race between the constitution, the federal constitution, and declarations of independence. How is that race going at around the time in 1815 when John Adams is writing? Well, it's going in interesting ways if we look at the Declaration of Independence. 1815, most Americans, most white Americans, let's be specific about this, are not terribly interested yet in the Declaration of Independence. It did its job. Independence was declared, it was fought for, ultimately recognized in 1783 by the Peace of Paris, probably the single most important document in American history. That's another discussion we could have here in terms of affirming the independence of the United States. And once its work is done, most Americans, white Americans, forget about the Declaration of Independence. Look through the multiple volumes of the debate on the Constitution. You can maybe find 4 or 5 quotations, if you really press that material hard, from the Declaration of Independence. It's gone. African Americans do remember the Declaration of Independence. They keep that flame alive. Very important to say. After the War of 1812, by 1815, uptick in interest in the Declaration of Independence within the United States, but after 20 or more years of ignorance. This may be a story also about to bear in mind in relation to the Constitution. Things can disappear off the map and then they can reappear under changed circumstances, especially changed international circumstances. The ultimate affirmation of American independence, we might say, was victory in the War of 1812, the end of the War of 1812. And at that point, the Declaration of Independence gets refurbished. Who's reading the Declaration of Independence circa 1815? Lots of Latin American revolutionaries. At the time when Adams is writing again in 1815, there are probably at least 20 declarations of independence already in existence, at least 15 of those in Venezuela and New Granada. There are declarations of independence from Flanders. There's one from Vermont. You remember Vermont was outside the Union before it came back into the Union. There are other declarations of independence aborning throughout the Iberian world in this period. And the Declaration of Independence then goes on to have a truly global career. It's not a smooth path, it's a punctuated path. It's a discontinuous one, but it's a cumulative one. Perhaps not surprisingly, declarations of independence appear in particular at the moments of the breakup of empires. The breakup of the Spanish Empire in the early 19th century, the breakup of the great land empires of Eurasia, the Hohenzollern Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and the Romanov Empire after the First World War, the beginnings of the breakup of European empires after the Second World War, and then also in the context of decolonization, and then much more recently in the context of the collapse of the Soviet Union. One of the ways in which you could tell the Soviet Union was an empire was because when it collapsed, it went up in a shower of declarations of independence, as other empires had done before. Declaration of Independence, in this sense, is still going extremely strong. There seemed to be a period in the late 1990s and the beginning of the 21st century when no one was declaring independence, but that's changed very recently. The breakup of Yugoslavia, 2006, Montenegro declares independence. 2008, Kosovo declares independence. Fast forward very slightly to the 6th of July 2011, South Sudan declares independence. More recently and less successfully last year, the northern Malian province of Azawad declared independence. All of these peoples, all of these places claim statehood in an international order, demanding recognition on the basis of a Declaration of Independence. No one had done that before 1776. Everyone who does that after 1776, consciously or unconsciously, is imitating an American document, an American form, an American original in world terms. And I think this is an important narrative to have in here, just as a comparison with the US Constitution as well, to show that there is an aspect of American constitutionalism, I would argue, I just at least asserted, if not argued, that it's the fundamental act of American constitutionalism, the one upon which all other acts of American constitutionalism rely and depend, and upon which they stand, the Declaration of Independence, which is the truly global contribution of American constitutionalism to the world. It also tells us, just as I draw a conclusion now, something very important about the Constitution itself, which other scholars than I have been writing about recently, that the Constitution was both an outward-facing document and an inward-facing document. Its inward-facing purposes we know very well, not least because of the failures of the Articles of Confederation. But its outward-facing form was equally important at the time that it was promulgated and also for some decades afterwards. It had to be produced in order to persuade the rest of the world, not least that the United States was a stable government with which the world could do business, and that it would act according to the prevailing norms of the law of nations and international law as they could be found in the late 18th century. And so many of the provisions of the US Constitution build that in, but the very fact of constitution making itself had an external validatory effect, a demand for recognition. Very important, therefore, to remember the Constitution was both about popular sovereignty, hugely important, as my colleagues have stressed, but also about international recognition as well. A message there, perhaps, for originalists in relation to the Constitution, originalists who might, in some of their forms and fashions, turn themselves against the idea, for instance, of paying any attention to foreign law, foreign jurisdictions, the findings of any laws or constitution-making bodies or courts outside the United States itself. That is not the way in which the framers thought about the Constitution itself. We have to remember the international dimensions of both the Declaration of Independence and of the Constitution at the same time that we remember their inward-looking domestic faces as well. What perhaps in conclusion might we learn from the comparison between the historical global trajectory of the Declaration of Independence and the declining historical trajectory globally of the US Constitution? We might learn that documents that are dynamic rather than static do better in the global race. We might learn that documents become durable because because of their adaptability, you can take the Declaration of Independence apart. It becomes a genre that is repeatable without necessarily any or all of the elements being combined, and a document which is functionally unamendable, at least in historical terms, like the US Constitution effectively, unlike the Declaration of Independence, which is more plastic and malleable, becomes a dead letter. The Declaration can travel much more widely, be more influential, shape more parts of the world more fundamentally. So that would be my argument in the end, that in historical terms, Declaration comes first, Constitution on top. Declaration is a much better model than the Constitution. Declaration much more important in shaping the world we inhabit than the Constitution.
Thank you very much, David Armitage. Until the very end of your remarks, I thought you were moving on Akhil's side, but then toward the end you swung over to David Laws. I'm going to ask a kind of big, vague question for which I would like actually brief responses from each of you, and then perhaps move on to some other issues. There are just so many issues that jump out of this topic. But one of the questions that emerges from this discussion is how important are written versus unwritten constitutions. David Law's presentation and really the extraordinarily well-researched, empirically based article that he and Mila Versteeg recently published in the NYU Law Review, it's 100 pages long, clearly does demonstrate empirically that increasingly constitutions being drafted around the world don't look much like the United States Constitution at all. It's pretty hard to, at least for me, to argue with the evidence that you present in that. Yet, Akhil's argument and his recently published book with the wholly appropriate title, The Unwritten Constitution, and I also think to some extent, David, your work on the Declaration of Independence suggests that there are larger and perhaps more important issues at stake. Democracy, popular sovereignty, political self-determination, etc. So let's grant, for at least for a moment, that David Law's got some pretty strong evidence on the way written constitutions are looking as they're written down on paper. Certainly, among other things, they are a lot longer, by and large. But so what? Does that really matter? When we look at the way in which constitutions actually operate. Take it away.
Okay, sure. Well, I think in the United States, in particular, the small c constitution, well, the practices, the conventions, the norms, the judicial interpretations have become incredibly important, but that's in large part because we haven't substantially revamped our constitution since, well, the Bill of Rights, but that was a couple of years, that's so 220 plus years ago still. Civil War amendments, okay, those were substantial, but that's not an awful lot of constitutional revision, right? So elsewhere you have, again, these longer, newer, more detailed constitutions, and that means that there is simply less need to rely on your small c constitution, right? If you have something that you wrote 10 years ago, right, you don't have the same need to rely on your constitutional court to fix it up, to keep it working, to make it modern, relevant, applicable. But I think that's also exactly part of the reason why other countries are not keen to copy the American constitutional approach. I mean, why copy the Rube Goldberg contraption when, in the last half of the 20th century, the number of constitutions in the world tripled, okay? We went from 60-something constitutions to nearly 200 constitutions, and that's not counting international human rights instruments. So there are so many new models out there for you to choose from. Why choose the patched up contraption with the things hanging off of it when you've got all these new attractive models? And what we see is they're choosing the new attractive models. I mean, if you want to define it as it's about democracy, right? American constitutionalism is the same as democracy, but it's not. You can choose democracy without choosing American constitutionalism. And that's exactly what we are seeing countries doing.
So Akhil, you've just finished writing a 600-plus page book about this inflexible U.S. Constitution. Do you have a response to David's response?
Yeah, I might try to emphasize 4 or 5 points. First.
But not in 600 pages.
No. I'll try to be quick. The document really does begin, we the people. That's of the essence of the thing. We give the world democracy on a continental scale, on a multicultural scale, and that just is America. That's what we do. It wasn't done before, and the rest is largely details. And it's there in that first paragraph, we the people. That's why I got up there and did that thing. I do ordain and establish. And it wasn't just words, it was a deed, it was putting to a vote that eliminated or reduced property qualifications in 8 of the 13 states. It's having epic free speech. So that's one thing. Second is, when you look at the document, basic features of it are not in so many words. The word judicial review do not appear in the Constitution, but it's in the Constitution. The words, the Bill of Rights, do not appear in what we call the Bill of Rights, but it's a Bill of Rights. The words rule of law, limited government, checks and balances, the word federalism doesn't appear, separation of powers, none of these things appears. And so I do fundamentally, it's a long article, but I fundamentally disagree with the methodology of sort of comparing word counts. That seems to me to have a fundamental problem of mismatch. I think the assessment needs to ultimately be more qualitative. Third, state constitutions are a huge part of the American constitutional experience. They're all longer than the federal. They're sort of closer in length to foreign constitutions. They all are...
I think California is about 1,000 pages now.
The Alabama Constitution is 300,000 words compared to 8,000 words of the federal Constitution. So there's a huge range. They're much easier to amend, and therefore, in certain respects, closer to these foreign models. Well, let me just leave it at there. Just those are, I think, 3 pushbacks.
David Armitage, do you want to hop in here, or do you want to?
I don't want to adjudicate between these 2 distinguished scholars of the U.S. Constitution along these lines, though it is noticeable to an historian, especially a historian of the late 18th century, how many elements of the U.S. Constitution were already effectively museum pieces at the time that the Constitution was ratified. The veto power, for instance, had not been used in Britain since 1707. The last impeachment trial in Britain was going to be in 1806. The idea of having indirect electors was going to disappear also in 1806 with the extinction of the Holy Roman Empire, etc., etc., etc. There were ways in which the US Constitution was archaic at the moment of its birth, so perhaps we should not be surprised that by enshrining some of these elements of the 18th century world, less familiar elements of the 18th century world, it would be unattractive ultimately on its 225-year career.
So with due respect, I think, as a scholar of the U.S. constitutional tradition, that gets it, with due respect, exactly wrong. Okay, so the U.S. Constitution is building on state constitutions that exist at the time. Almost everything in the U.S. Constitution was road-tested first by the states. Putting it to a vote, Massachusetts and New Hampshire did that. 3 branches of government, bicameralism, most of the states have that. Judicial review already in the states, jury trial, and so on and so on. Then what happens is state constitutions over the next 200 years, and they're easy to amend, my friend, actually move increasingly to look like the U.S. Constitution in a whole bunch of ways. For example, 8 of the 13 states at the time of the Constitution, state legislatures pick the governor. They all move to a presidentialist model of independent election of the president. 4-year terms in 46 or 48 of the 50 states, veto pens, pardon pens. So in fact, we have a very robust American tradition, 50 states, and lots of modern stuff, and so this isn't antiquated, it's just different than the Brits in a whole bunch of ways. And I do think, even at the federal level, here was maybe the one other point, the federal Constitution was pro-slavery in all sorts of ways. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are radical revisions of everything, huge. But I don't think that's, and that's, you could say, well, that's still 150 years ago, but I think the 17th Amendment is a pretty important revision when when senators are free to pursue nationalist projects without having to win re-election in state legislatures. The 19th Amendment is epic when you bring women into the process. When you have the 16th Amendment and a federal income tax, which is about a progressive, redistributive, soak the rich, Buffett rule income tax. And it is. It's clearly about that. It's brought to you by people who call themselves progressives, believe in a progressive income tax. 16 plus 17 plus 19 will equals the New Deal, the Great Society, Obamacare. So the modern administrative state is building on progressive, even 20th century amendments, because women vote for the nanny state. They like the welfare state. We call that the gender gap. Barack Obama may probably lose the men's vote, but he's still going to, if he wins re-election, it's because of the 19th Amendment. Franklin and Eleanor are because of the 19th Amendment, and Bill and Hillary, and Barack and Michelle. So I would not downplay the significance of these even 20th century amendments.
Okay. Thank you. David, you want a few more words?
I would just say, if the evidence that the world has embraced American constitutionalism is what the states are doing, that's pretty sad. If you've got to look within your borders to see, we're influencing the world. There's Missouri and Idaho and California. That's, at some level, this move of equating democracy with American constitutionalism, that's, from a distance, all paintings are just paintings, and from outer space, all countries look the same, right? If you're talking about the level at which constitutional drafters actually do their work and make decisions, right? There are different ways of implementing democracy, and as Professor Marr pointed out himself, the British way of designing democracy, the British had democracy. I don't know to what extent we can uniquely claim credit for democracy, and the British style of democracy, right, the British parliamentary system or some version of it is more popular than the American version.
I want to move us to some relatively recent developments in constitutionalism. One of the major findings of David Law's NYU article is that many nations have a much longer and more explicit articulation of what constitutes basic human rights. And indeed, the various transnational declarations of human rights are now having a greater effect on other nations' efforts at constitution making than our own Bill of Rights. Our own Bill of Rights looks pretty skinny compared to the declarations of rights of more modern constitutions. And indeed, this is a part of the debate that's currently going on among our own Supreme Court justices as to what extent the justices should be looking at these international declarations of rights and shaping their own opinions. But I want to ask each of you this question. To what extent has that more explicit articulation of human rights actually led to a greater protection of human rights in those nations that have embraced those long lists?
That's an excellent question, and I'm going to shamelessly plug. Professor Versteeg and I have a new paper we just posted called Sham Constitutions, which is about the global prevalence and severity of constitutional noncompliance. And the findings are depressing. Countries with more rights in their constitutions tend to violate rights more. The more, guess what? The more you promise, the harder it becomes to keep your promises. Surprise, right? Countries that prohibit torture, there's a positive correlation between countries that prohibit torture and countries that engage in torture. If you prohibit torture, you're more likely to actually engage in torture. That doesn't mean that proves causation, but it's pretty depressing. So you can put rights in your constitution. It definitely doesn't guarantee anything. However, the ambitions of the world, at least, right? If you take these rights as articulations of ideals, the articulation is not moving in the direction of the American paradigm. There are 25 rights that are found in 70+% of the world's constitutions. And compared to this generic Bill of Rights, the core that you find everywhere, the American Constitution is both skinny and fat, right? It's skinnier in some places, fatter than others. There are 11 rights of these generic rights that are not found in the US Constitution, but there are also 6 that are in the US Constitution that are not in the generic Bill of Rights. So we're both over and under broad. We're out of sync in both having things that aren't globally popular and having things that we have things that they don't have and they have things that we don't have. So for example, the right to bear arms is not popular globally. We're now down to 2 countries that have it. The separation of church and state, actually not very popular either on a global scale. But we also promise things that, there are many things we don't promise that are very common, for instance, a constitutional presumption of innocence, the right to form political parties, we don't even mention, as Professor Lamar pointed out, we don't even mention it. 2/3 of the world's countries have an explicit constitutional right to form political parties. So we are badly out of sync with global trends, but when it comes to actual performance, there are countries that promise less than they, deliver less than they promise. Those are, you've got North Korea, there is an example. There are also countries that deliver more than they promise. Australia has no Bill of Rights, but, for all practical intents and purposes, they look like us when it comes to their actual performance. So it's a complicated question, but definitely what you see on paper is no guarantee. And on top of that, we find that the fallback mechanisms that lawyers always, let's put in judicial review, that'll guarantee rights will be observed. Let's sign human rights treaties, that'll do it. There's no relationship statistically between ratifying human rights treaties and upholding rights. There's no relationship statistically between having judicial review and whether rights are observed. So it's depressing.
I know Akil wants to hop in here. He's been...
Well, I think there are connections between some of the things we've been talking about within the American experience. So why does the Ninth Amendment say that there may be unenumerated rights? Why didn't we just enumerate them all? And here's one reason why. Because we wanted a short text, a terse text. And if you want a short text, you can't enumerate all the powers. There's no bank clause in the Constitution. There's no individual mandate clause on the power side. And you can't enumerate all the rights. The right to wear a hat, the right to have a pet dog, to play the fiddle, to lie on your back at night, and a gazillion others. So why didn't they write a longer document? And John Marshall explained why in a case called McCulloch versus Maryland. He said, because if they did write a longer document, it could never be understood by the public. So the Europeans have when they try to propose something recently, it's a 300-word document whose preamble is longer than our whole Constitution, and ordinary people can't grasp it. So if you're going to have popular sovereignty as the basis and actually have ordinary farmers vote on the thing, whether they're for it or against it, and have ordinary people today basically be able to understand whether they want to change it or not, it can't be too long. That's what Marshall says in McCulloch versus Maryland. If so, you're going to not probably be able to list all the rights. And the Ninth Amendment is there, and the 14th Amendment says there are unenumerated privileges and immunities. And that's precisely, you see, what David Law's counting is missing. All of our unenumerated rights that are absolutely rock solid. They're part of our tradition. They're in statutes. They're in state constitutions. They're in case law, presumption of innocence, proof beyond reasonable doubt, a gazillion things, and they may be textually specified in other foreign constitutions, but that doesn't make them different than ours. It's just, it would show up as a difference the way he's doing his counting, because it's not in ours and it is in theirs, but in fact, it's just two different ways of enforcing the same thing. We do ours through statutes, state constitutions, common law, judicial review, unenumerated stuff, and they may codify some of it. So that's why the ultimate analysis couldn't be this kind of counting. That just isn't going to measure what you really want to find out.
I'm going to ask one more question before we open it up to all of you, and maybe I'll begin with you, David Armitage, if you don't mind. It's a question that popped into my mind over the course of the last week as I was thinking about this session. We are, of course, in the Middle East witnessing a dramatic display, not only of the difference in constitutional provisions, but in societal values between the United States and many of the countries in that region. Very different attitudes toward our First Amendment, guarantee of free speech and freedom of expression, no matter how obnoxious that speech might be. And indeed, in many European countries, some of which do have impressive guarantees of rights of free speech, their legislatures and parliaments have passed laws punishing hate speech. So they're a classic case of rights in conflict. Where does the United States stand in relation to the rest of the world on that issue of freedom of expression?
In the very broadest sense, as your question implies, the United States stands very far out ahead of many, if not most parts of the world in guaranteeing freedom of speech and opening up the widest possible arena where that can be enacted. I was thinking as I was coming up this morning reading the newspaper about the case in France this morning of the publication of anti-Muslim caricatures or cartoons in a satirical newspaper, which sharpened this both as a question of the collision of rights and also contrasts with the United States as well, that the question of freedom of speech is to be able to say anything without constraint. But then what about the questions of the judgment of the times and the places, the conditions under which one would do that? This case of promulgating anti-Muslim caricatures seemed like a very good example of showing a case where judgment about potential consequences must be brought into any discussion of the potential collision of rights. Rights are claims. Rights are claims upon other people, upon their dignity as much as anything else. And human judgment, political judgment becomes essential in that. And in the American case, Americans try to keep the widest possible range for that. But these issues become very controversial, as is very evident from these cases around the world.
Thank you. Any other comments on that from either of you?
I would say that the world is divided, right? The freedoms that we consider fundamental, we take for granted. It's quite clear that they are not widely respected or adopted in many other places. Constitutional law has become a site of global contestation. You can't take the autonomy of U.S. constitutional law for granted when you have caricatures published in Copenhagen promote riots in Khartoum and Karachi, and the governments in Paris and London are fretting over how the Americans are going to respond, right? I don't want to sound alarmist. I don't want to make an argument that sounds like the Samuel Huntington Clash of Civilizations. Here we go, Clash of Civilizations. But having said that, empirically, you can tease out, using statistical methods, there are patterns. There are constitutional families out there, right? And so the world is not a unitary place. Within our family, you could call it the libertarian family, you can call it the common law family. There are a lot of similarities, and it's not, other New Zealand, Australia, Canada, these countries are not radically dissimilar from one another in their constitutions. But this is not a case of American constitutionalism, American democracy simply spreading around the world, unchallenged. It's just not the case. Mm-hmm. American influence is challenged in every sphere. Constitutional law is no different.
Thank you. I was discussing this issue 2 days ago on my daily walk. It used to be a daily run, but I've now had double knee replacements, so it's a daily walk with a friend with whom I've been running and now walking with for about 40 years. And he said something that was interesting. When Oliver Wendell Holmes articulated his limits on American free speech about not, shouting fire in a crowded theater. Schenck versus the United States, is that the case? He really was talking about shouting fire in a local community. But now we really do, communication-wise, live in a global community. So there really are questions about shouting fire in a way that is not just heard in the local cinema, but around the world. So we do in this country believe in pretty close to unlimited free speech, but it is interesting how we see the implications of those beliefs.
And maybe one distinction, I'm not sure that Holmes is actually the best theorist of free speech. That's basically what they teach up at Harvard Law School, because he was a Harvard guy, but down at Yale we have our doubts. Holmes had a very bleak vision of the world, possibly because his body was absolutely shattered ad Antietam, which took place 150 years ago this week. But But there's a big difference between a false statement of fact that could induce a panic, like fire, and the expression of a political opinion or a religious opinion. And in the American tradition, at least as jurists today understand it, opinions are different than facts, and people are entitled to their opinions even if others take offense at it. And so Holmes was blurring all sorts of distinctions that have come to be absolutely central in later jurisprudence.
Okay, thank you, Akil. I think we will open it up to questions, and I'm going to count on folks from the Constitution Center to wander around and see who would like to ask a question. I would emphasize that this is a question and answer session, and your job is to ask the questions, not give the answers as a preface to your questions. So if you could keep them brief, we would all be grateful. Yes, sir.
I have a question for Professor Law. Are you aware of the extent to which countries that have adopted more modern constitutions have been successful, maybe measured in terms of like bills passed per session, the extent to which legislation reflects public opinion, so on and so forth?
The one aggregate finding we have is our hypothesis going into this was that older constitutions might enjoy greater compliance. The theory being that the longer the constitution's around, the more time people have to get used to it. We didn't find any evidence of that. That's a tough causal question to answer, so we cannot rule out that it's true, but we personally didn't find any evidence that there's a relationship between how old your constitution is and how successful or effective it is. And that's coming on the California Law Review, and you can get it online. So.
Yes, sir, up there.
So this is, I suppose, a question directed at Professor Laws, but also somewhat at the panel. And that is, it seems to me that it's almost, we would expect there to be, if there is an adoption of American constitutionalism, surely it would only be in the basic principles because, every different country has its own different situations, particularly the focus of sort of Islam. So I suppose my question is, to what extent would you be, would the question of the influence of the American Constitution be almost sort of non-question, because it would be quite odd if very distinct polities had the same kind of political rules as the one that governs this one?
It's an excellent
Anybody
question.
can jump in here.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think to some extent it would be surprising if other countries were en masse to copy the American model. Having said that, there's plenty of examples of countries with constitutions that have simply been copied or given to them by some other country that really don't fit. The best example of this historically would be the British colonies throughout Africa and the Caribbean. The British Home Office basically said, right, here's the European Convention on Human Rights, copy, paste, here you go, here's your constitution. So there are plenty of examples of that, and perhaps, and I'm speculating now, perhaps one of the reasons we don't see more of this imposed constitutionalism outside of the very obvious cases such as Japan or the Philippines in the case, or Liberia in the case of the United States, may be simply that our colonialism tended not to be of a formal, legal nature, such that we would assume those kinds of formal nation-building responsibilities. Here's your constitution, right? The British assumed those sorts of responsibilities. We didn't so much.
So my thought is your question. Look, it's not that all constitutions in the world were democratic. Until the United States Constitution, there were almost no democratic constitutions. That's the fundamental distinction. You have a democratic society or not. And America chooses in 1787 a democratic path, and the world has chosen that. That's the division, and there are more democratic constitutions now than ever before, and that's because of America. So that's the fundamental thing, and everything else isn't so important, because what's ultimately important is you have democracy, whether it's a separation of powers democracy, or a parliamentary democracy, or a multi-party democracy, or a two-party democracy. Those are largely details. It's like whether you drive on the left or the right side of the road. And he's saying, oh, but you look, and the gear shifts are completely different, because one is on, the steering wheel is on the left, and the steering wheel is on the right, but they're both cars. And so that's the fundamental, that's what I'm claiming. In our world.
They're all paintings.
No, because they're not all paintings, because there were only two democratic paintings in the world in 1787. They weren't all paintings, they were something else and worse. And now, lots more people are painting.
except for
What do
the
you
British.
say, David Armitage? Is there a middle ground here on this one?
Again, I'm not trying not to get crushed by the millstones of these two scholars here, but I mean, I throw this back to Akhil. Just clarify what you mean by democratic in this sense. Do you, in a fundamental sense, you might say democratic is the opposite, as you said, of aristocratic, monarchical, hereditary.
Yes.
I think you're absolutely right. That's the great breakthrough of the late 18th century, is the move from a world dominated by hereditary forms of power to non-hereditary forms of power. And I think that's as fundamental a definition of a democratic shift as you can get. It's an incomplete transition,
Yes.
of course. 1/7 of the world still has some forms of monarchical power, aristocratic power even now, and just about 100%, maybe not 100%, but a very large part of the world has hereditary distribution of wealth, for instance. Are we still not in a world where, at least in terms of the distribution of wealth, the world is undemocratic, even if formally democratic through its constitutional and legal processes?
So Rick may be able to tell us this, but I think it's the first paragraph of the Federalist Papers. Rogers, I'm sure, will be able to tell us. The fundamental question is whether people are going to be governed by force or ultimately by kind of consent. And, and that's the first paragraph of the Federalist and the last paragraph, and that's the fundamental divide.
Yes, but this 18th century historian would say these folks who framed the Constitution really did consider themselves small r Republicans, not small d Democrats, and few of them saw democracy alone as the solution to a government that was both stable and just. So I'm a little more sympathetic to David Law's devil in the details analysis here, but I think I think it's a very difficult and good, very good question.
I'm willing to accept, for the sake of argument, that America is responsible for the triumph of democracy, okay? Forget the French, forget the British. Let's just say it's the United States, right? But, you know, the way that
Was that
America's...
sincere? I wasn't sure.
But
I'll take it.
Yeah, you should, please. Right, dozo. So, but, you know, even if that's the case, is it really American constitutionalism that has driven the spread of democracy? I mean, America is an economic superpower and a military superpower. Now, you want to draw the causal connection. You say, well, it's because our constitutional system is so wonderful that we became so powerful, and it's with our power that we then promoted the Constitution. That's a long causal argument to make. There's a lot of big steps you have to make there. It could also be the fact that, you know, we were incredibly well endowed with natural resources. We had Canada to the north, not too much of a problem there, except when they burned down the White House. So you had all these circumstances that were very conducive to the development of American military and economic power. You open your doors to migrants while other countries are trying to kick them out. So you've got all these macroeconomic factors pushing in favor of American power. Is it really the Constitution that deserves the credit for America's role in the popularity of democracy globally? Again, you know, I just have to keep coming back to this. Democracy, countries buy democracy without buying American constitutionalism. And we should be glad that they buy democracy. And maybe we should not feel so sad that they're not buying American constitutionalism, because if Professor Marr is right, that democracy is what matters, that's all we should care about. But that doesn't mean they're buying American constitutionalism.
Other questions? Yeah. Yes, sir.
So pardon me, it seems like there's, arguing that it's, the rest is just details does leave out a couple of major areas, it seems to me. And so two specifically that haven't been mentioned much. One in which enumerated, you know, it not being enumerated means we don't have access to it, which is positive rights, socioeconomic rights. What's the trend, and how do you all think about that as we see new constitutions going in very different directions? And the other is where wording has locked in understandings, and that's around private property norms. And it seems like many countries are going in a very different direction with significant implications. So would love to hear your thoughts.
Excellent.
Who'd like to start?
I can answer the empirical part of that, which is, I take it partly you're asking, are socioeconomic rights increasingly popular? They are, but they're growing in popularity, but it's one of those things where members of one constitutional family like them and members of the other don't so much, right? So you're seeing there is this generic core of rights that countries like, and then beyond that, you're seeing a certain degree of polarization. It's like there are two variants. Everyone has ice cream, and there's chocolate ice cream, there's vanilla ice cream, right? And so you have the statist constitutions that adopt more of these socioeconomic rights, but the common law countries don't really show signs of buckling, going, oh, you're right, we really should include the following 10 social welfare rights in our constitutions. You don't see that happening so much as an empirical matter.
One does see more positive rights in state constitutions. For example, virtually every state constitution has a right of education. And I keep encouraging you to think not just of the federal constitution and thinking about American constitutionalism, but state constitutions as well.
David Armitage, you want to? Yeah.
Why don't the American people want more social rights?
Because they have them by statute.
By statute.
Public education, Social Security. What are we missing?
Universal health care.
Yeah, environmental
sort of.
protection. Yeah. Oh, universal health. Yeah, that's right. There you go.
So I can't resist asking this question. We'll have one or more, two more from the audience, but I'm wondering which one of you, David Law or Akhil Amar, would embrace Mitt Romney's notion of American exceptionalism. Not his political platform, but this very conception of America's historical and constitutional experience as being utterly exceptional.
Barack Obama is as much an American exceptionalist as Mitt Romney, so Mitt Romney does not have a monopoly on American exceptionalism. He's got actually a pretty weird understanding of the history of America, in fact.
So, Americans want to be proud of their Constitution, right? You want to be proud of the thing you pledge allegiance to. You can be proud of it because it's influential. You can be proud of it because it's exceptional. But those two things are kind of in conflict. If you have an exceptional Constitution, it's an idiosyncratic Constitution, different way of saying the same thing. And the more idiosyncratic you are, the less influential you are. And the more influential you are, the more other countries are going to look like you, and so the less exceptional you are, right? So you kind of have to pick one or the other.
Yeah. I think I erred in invoking Romney's name in the context of that question, but you both put me straight. Thank you. Time for a couple more questions. Yes.
I have two very small little questions. One for Professor Armitage. What do you think about in the Declaration of Independence? What do you think about the founding father misconception of equality? Was it intentional or was it political? They say that all people are created equal. Actually, it takes 6 years old to understand that people are not created equal. Some people are created moron, and some people are created very intelligent. They are covering up the original concept of Christian equality, which is equality of accountability. What do you think? My question, my second one, between the two professors.
You know what? That's a big enough question. So let's let Professor Armitage stick with that one question and move on.
Okay.
All men are created equal is a way of saying all men are not created unequal, which again is coming back to Akhil's point about that fundamental bedrock conception of democracy. There's no statement of in what dimensions, for what capacities, in what circumstances equality might be judged. It's a simple statement of non-inequality, which is so fundamental in sweeping the ground clear to build everything else on top. It's controversial. You can fill in the details. You can argue about what equality might mean. But by saying effectively not unequal, you clear the ground for all the other major statements that can be built upon that. That's a fundamental shift.
Thank you. I think up top, I don't know whether it's my eyesight or the lighting, but if you've got a microphone and are ready to ask a question, please do so.
I just wanted to ask that they said the separation of church and state. Well, so I heard it wasn't in the Constitution. It was on a letter by Jefferson to one of the churches. That it just says that the Constitution says that government should make no laws that for churches, for the practice of religion or anything. But the church and state was in a letter from Jefferson.
Akhil, you want to take that one?
Well, it's a good reminder, you see, that the sentence doesn't appear, and some people think the concept is in the Constitution, but there are different understandings of it. And this is why I'm fundamentally skeptical of, frankly, the very empirical method in this very big project. Political scientists say it's a coding question about how the counting is actually occurring and whether the counting of words in different documents is really going to give us the best picture of patterns of similarity and difference. For example, we have separation of powers, but there are different versions of separation of powers, just like there are different versions of separation of church and state. There are different ways to codify political parties. Actually, political parties are a huge part of the American Constitution, and even in the words, but you have to look carefully to see where actually political parties are explicitly mentioned and implicitly built in. So it's just a good reminder that there are all sorts of things that are difficult to get one's hands on textually.
Ma'am, I thought that was a bit obfuscating. We're just talking about the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which is really what I thought Akhil was going to mention. We're not counting, we're reading. We're just reading an awful lot of constitutions, and the separation of church and state is how the Establishment Clause is generally understood. And that sort of clause is not very popular on a global scale.
Okay. I think we have maybe time for one more question. Yes, please.
I know these types of questions are difficult or impossible to answer. What would the framers say if they were present at the Japanese framing? But are there fundamental differences in the details that our framers would disagree with? Would they say, the specifications are too detailed, we want something that's more terse, more open-ended, or they say, this is democracy, the paintings, I'm glad that you guys have arrived at this democratic model, and I'm not really going to quibble with whether you're going to include a right to education or things like that. So that's kind of the question. What are the differences between the Japanese Constitution and the American Constitution so great that our framers would put up a big fight, if that makes sense?
I think we better turn to David Law for this one.
What would the framers... Well, okay. Let's say that the framers didn't want to spell out everything you see spelled out in the Japanese Constitution because they wanted the document to be more readable and accessible, as Professor Mara suggested. At first, if their goal was to make the document readable and accessible, I don't think they did a very good job. Second, the Japanese Constitution contains all these provisions. It's clear that the American framers of the Japanese Constitution thought the way to go is not to have this very terse document, but rather to spell things out in greater detail. I can't tell you why that's the sense, but that is increasingly the sense among constitutional drafters around the world. You don't want to have the short document. Here's one possible explanation, and it goes to Justice Frankfurter's advice to the Indian constitutional drafters not to have a due process clause. That is, you don't want to have 100+ years of fighting over some cryptic phrase, right, of trying to basically have the words due process do the work of an entire Bill of Rights. It's just not a good idea. And so there is this trend towards specificity and spelling things out. And I think there are good reasons for that. I think partly people want to avoid some of the mistakes that were made in American constitutional. At the time, they might have looked like a good idea. With the benefit of hindsight, it's crazy not to learn from experience. Okay, we've got to learn from experience. We don't, there's no point in continuing to insist that the way things were done in 1787 and 1789 is the way things ought to be done. Other countries aren't doing it, and we should be frank about the fact that there's a lot that we could revise and improve with the benefit of hindsight. We should work on making the more perfect union rather than defending the one that we came up with then.
I wish I had the wit to come up with a concise and elegant conclusion to this wonderful discussion. I don't. I will conclude by saying that from one perspective, David Law's observation that the American Constitution compared to other world constitutions is suffering from being the oldest national constitution, not the oldest written constitution, because the state constitutions preceded it. And so from that comparative perspective, that doesn't sound like such good news. But to jump in Akhil's camp, I think we should be pretty happy that it's the oldest and most durable constitution, however much we might disagree over what its provisions actually mean. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Akhil, David Law, David Armitage.